So I was first taught that mantra, Om Mani Padme Hum, long time ago, over 30 years ago. I was in a little town called Dharamsala, which is in the foothills of the Himalayas. There's a big Tibetan community there that moved there when they fled from Tibet. And I didn't really know much about Buddhism or Tibetans at the time, but I'd been I was traveling around India, and they sort of said, "Oh, you got to go to this town." So I went on this crazy, 24-hour bus journey or something on hard wooden seats to this place, and it's kind of this magic. It's a magical place, and I kind of got into this Buddhism thing, and I heard about this thing called the Dalai Lama, and I was like, "Oh, that's so cool! I'd like to do that." And I got to ask the Dalai Lama once. I was like, "How do I become the Dalai Lama?" Now, if you don't know, then it turns out it's an incarnational thing. He's the 14th incarnation of the Dalai Lama, and when he dies, then they have to go and find out where he's reincarnated. So he laughed. I made the Dalai Lama laugh. Turns out making Tibetans laugh is not very hard. They laugh a lot. They're very happy people. And they say this thing, Om Mani Padme Hum, all the time. Anyway, when I was there, I went to this lecture. You had to go down from the town to the big monastery. And there was somebody giving a lecture, and it was in English. He was giving the lecture in Tibetan, but there was a translator who translated it. And there weren't very many of us in the room. And it was a very high philosophical conversation about Buddhist philosophy. And it was way over my head at the time. I think it would still be way over my head right now. And in it, one of the things he was talking about was various concepts around the idea of enlightenment. And one of the terms that the Buddha used to describe himself was the Tathagata. It's kind of a cool word, Tathagata. Anyway, so there was this, it was just how he referred to himself was as the Tathagata. And then there's another concept in Buddhism about Buddha nature. And so obviously the Buddha called himself the Tathagata, and then you've got Buddha nature. They're clearly quite closely related, these two things. But one of the senses is that we all have Buddha nature. Everybody has Buddha nature. And that within our Buddha nature is this potential for becoming a Tathagata, whatever that means. It means the thusness or the suchness or something. Doesn't really matter. But there is this sense in which the Tathagata is contained within this thing of Buddha mind, or at least there's the potential. It's sometimes called the Buddha nature is Tathagata embryo, like it's the embryo from which you can become the Tathagata. And there's also this big concept in Buddhism about emptiness. So anyway, sitting in front of me is this PhD student, this American woman. She's very earnest. She took notes throughout the lecture. And then there was the time for questions. And so she got to ask this question. And she's like, but I don't understand. If there is the Tathagata, and the Buddha nature contains the Tathagata, but there is emptiness, how can there be emptiness and Tathagata? And there is this thing. It happens in every single religion. There are these, we can get wound into these philosophical problems, like in the detail. Christianity has all these things, they talk about the Trinity. God is three, God is one. Well, make up your mind. Is it three or is it one? Christianity, one of the other big problems is problem of evil. How do we explain God is good? How come there is evil? And you can study this, and it's quite interesting. There are all these very clever theories about why there is evil in the world. The most popular sort of trite answer is God gave us free will. In her great wisdom, she gave us free will. Why? Why give us free will if we're just going to be nasty to each other? Doesn't make any sense. Anyway, there are some more sophisticated theories around the problem of evil, and some of them you go, oh, yeah, that's quite good. But one of the biggest theologians in Christianity of all time was this guy called Thomas Aquinas. And he spent a lot of time thinking about all these problems, all these philosophical problems in Christianity. And he actually wrote massive quantities on the subject of all these problems. He pretty much solved all of the philosophical problems. He had 3 secretaries, 8 hours each, because he worked non-stop. It's all in Latin too, which is kind of crazy. But anyway, so massive quantities. It's called, this thing called the Summa Theologica is his full body of work. And it's stunning in the amount of words. It's literally just millions of words that he wrote. and incredibly philosophically interesting, clever, fascinating. And then at the end of his life, he had this experience. He was in a church in Spain, and he had this experience whereby he actually had an experience of God. He had this mystical experience. And he said one more thing. And he said after this experience, he said, I've had this experience. I've been granted, I've been blessed by this grace of having an experience of God. Everything I have written, all those millions of words, are but a pile of straw. It's meaningless. Because we can get into these philosophical things and using our intellect to try and understand God, whether you're looking at it as a sociologist, anthropologist, psychologist, or as a theologian trying to work out how can God be good and there be evil. We can get into this thing in our intellect and we can try and find truth via intellect. But actually what the mystics have suggested is don't do that. Even Thomas Aquinas sort of said, yeah, I wrote a lot. People are going to read this stuff for the rest of time. They still do. Catholics, they love, their pride and joy is if they've got the full Summa, they call it. The full Summa, I've got the full Summa. When Catholic couples get divorced, they're like, who gets the Summa? It's like, that's the big, they don't care about the kids. It's like, who gets the Summa? Except that Thomas Aquinas himself said, it's rubbish. It's complete rubbish. It's a waste of time. What you want to have is you want to have the experience. Don't get caught up in all of the philosophy. Have the experience. One of the analogies that I like is it's like a rose. It's like smelling a rose. If somebody had smelt a rose and they wrote beautiful poetry and description of what the rose smells like, you could read that. But it would be pointless. Why read it and try and go, ooh, now I know what a rose smells like? No, you don't. It doesn't matter how clever it is. It doesn't matter how many PhDs you read on what a rose smells like. They are all worthless the moment you actually smell a rose. And so the premise of this, the reason people meditate within these spiritual traditions is because they're not trying to rely on what so-and-so said and what so-and-so said about what so-and-so said, and then what so-and-so said about what so-and-so said about what so-and-so said. And you read all these different commentaries. It's like, no. Have the experience. Smell the rose. And when this PhD student in Dharamsala asked this question to this Tibetan monk, like, what is the difference between Tathagata and Buddha mind? The question had to be translated into Tibetan. And so we're sitting there in the translation, and the guy just bursts into hysterics. He cannot stop laughing. Tears are rolling down his face. He's laughing and laughing and laughing. And of course, this very earnest PhD student is like really upset. Steam's coming out of her ears. Like, why are you laughing at me? And then he sort of said something in Tibetan, and it was translated. And what he said was, he says, I have no idea. But when you're enlightened, let me know. And in some respects, I think he was trying to say, don't get caught up in this intellectual battle to try and find truth using this thing. Even though there's a long tradition of trying to use this thing to find truth, what most of the great mystics have said is like, smell the rose. And then you don't have to read all these things about what a rose smells like. You'll probably, if you then read them, you'll go, now I know what they were trying to say. Yeah, I sort of agree with that. I think a rose, yeah, it does smell a little bit like that. But you're not relying on that. You have the experience. Smell the rose. And that's, I think, why we meditate, even if it's just because we get glimpses of this every so often. And then we forget, but we get glimpses.